Beyond the Horizon of Metal. By Elton Gar. Professor Angston Trumble wasn't the first person to stand on this world. But he was the first person of any importance. There had been the Space Scout, of course. An uneducated lout, he had hit the lottery when he found this world, though he clearly hadn't known the value of having discovered not only a world worth visiting, but one that had the largest and most intact alien city ever found. After that was the military investigation. They had claimed their interference was minimal, which in military parlance probably meant they'd only destroyed the bare minimum amount of priceless artifacts. But he was the first true colonist on this world, and certainly the first person who understood its importance. That wasn't something he had ever expected to be. He had enjoyed a comfortable life on one of the paradise worlds, teaching archaeology during the day, and reluctantly attending dinner parties with people who tried to convince him they were his equals in the evenings. But founding the first colony on Zantheus was too good of an opportunity to turn down. And it wasn't as if it was going to be wasting his time farming. He was needed to understand this megacity that covered almost a quarter of the planet's landmass. An area nearly the size of Germany, according to the surveyors. They didn't even have to live in the fabricated buildings that the swarmbots built. The tiny robots could build a comfortable enough house, but they were blocky and utilitarian in a way that made them feel like you were surviving rather than thriving. The entirety of the colony, almost 200 people, were going to move into one of the skyscrapers in one of the many city centers. This building had been picked because the military had, presumably, landed on the first flat surface they had found, and the bureaucrats had insisted they go to the same place. He'd move them somewhere more appropriate eventually, but for now it would work. The building was a block square and perhaps 200 stories tall. It was hard to tell exactly what it had been from the outside. He carried a flashlight, not trusting the soldiers' insistence that he wouldn't need it. But as he opened the door, the lights in the stairwell turned on. At least they got one thing right, he thought, as he began to move down the hallway and open the first door he approached. It was metal, like almost everything they had seen in the city. Presumably, there had been other things in the city as well. But without anyone to preserve them, they would have been lost to age. The door led to what the professor could only describe as a penthouse apartment. It was a series of 6 rooms connected by doorways and short halls. They were all empty. They didn't even have dust or cobwebs. As the most senior person in the colony, both physically and in rank, he decided that he should take this. He'd allow them to take rooms further down. He'd be happy to stay here, he thought, as he walked into the second of the rooms. A huge curved room that had a window that covered the entirety of the outside wall allowed him a view of much of the city.
Have my things brought here. But everyone should stay in the ship or on the top floor today. I don't want anyone straying too far until we can be certain it's safe,
the professor said, trying to be clear because he had doubts about Greta's ability to follow simple instructions. She hadn't been picked for her brain.
It's a beautiful room, sir,
his assistant said. She was a luxury that a new colony probably shouldn't have, but it was hard to imagine not having an assistant. And when he had given his previous assistant the opportunity to come, she had decided she'd rather stay in school.
I could sit here for hours drinking tea and imagining what this world was like when the city was crowded with people,
Angston said. Perhaps the people who had built this world would be worthy of his attention, unlike most humans.
What do you think they were like?
Greta asked.
Based on what we've seen, they must have been a lot like us. Or at least roughly the same size,
Angston said. The rooms were large and the doorways bigger than humans needed, but there were human doors that big too. Just usually not in people's homes.
I'll get your stuff,
Greta said. Angston watched Greta leave, then turned back to the window. He found a wide metal recliner just like the one he had been thinking of, except in his mind, it had been padded and covered in fabric. And next to it, on a small metal table that was roughly the same as the one in his home, was a teacup. It was even designed similarly to his favorite, except that it was entirely metal. The soldiers hadn't said anything about hallucinations or ghosts. But he hadn't bothered reading their stuff that carefully. Or more accurately, he had stopped reading after the second grammar error. But it shouldn't surprise him that whoever had built this had technology significantly better than humans. Their entire city was beyond the limits of human technology.
Can you hear me?
The professor asked. There was no answer, but assuming it was real, the chair and the tea both seemed a gesture of goodwill. Perhaps he would have a competent assistant after all. The chair was remarkably comfortable for being solid metal. He'd still add a couple of pillows once his things were here. As he sat and looked out the window, everyone else moved supplies out of the ship. He took a sip of the tea without thinking. It wasn't just good. It was better than any tea he had ever had. But it was still tea, not some other similar drink. It was just how he imagined tea should be, instead of what it really was. But he shouldn't be focused on the tea. It seemed clear that something in the city was connecting to his mind. There was something strange about that. Not so much that it was happening, but how little he really cared that it was happening. He was aware it was strange and planned to find out why, but for now he just watched the city. The professor sat in the metal chair, sipping his tea, his gaze sweeping over the alien skyline, each building a silent testament to a civilization that had vanished into the echoes of time. Greta returned, her steps echoing softly in the empty chamber.
Your belongings are here, Professor,
She announced, setting down a small case. Her voice interrupted his thoughts. That she didn't mention the chair or the tea suggested that whatever was keeping him calm was working on her too. That, or she hadn't realized this place was empty before. You could never underestimate how stupid the average person was. He almost said something, but instead said,
Thank you, Greta. Make sure everyone stays close today.
As he watched Greta leave, the professor's thoughts were once again broken. This time by the sound of commotion outside. Peering down, he saw a group of colonists gathered around a piece of technology unearthed from the debris. Among them stood Derek, an arrogant man who thought he was smarter than everyone else. Derek saw the city as a trove of technological wonders to be exploited, not a cultural heritage to be preserved.
I was clear that you weren't to dismantle anything. This isn't a race.
Angston said.
This is absolutely a race. Or do you think that there aren't going to be other colonists sent to the most impressive find in human history?
Derek said. Everyone should know he was right, so why did he have to explain himself? But the professor had long ago learned that people needed to have their hands held, so he said.
There is something odd going on with this place that we haven't determined yet. If it's an eye, then I don't want to trigger a defense mechanism. So stop screwing around.
Over the next few days, people began to slowly explore the city, with its sprawling, silent streets and towering structures. While Angston stayed in his office and focused on the big picture, the rest of the colony engaged with the city in less impressive ways. Derek managed to activate an irrigation system that began to bring the city back to life. Water flowed through ancient channels, bringing with it the promise of greenery in the massive city. A trivial manipulation of existing infrastructure, hardly worthy of note. Greta, on the other hand, stumbled upon a library, its shelves not burdened by books but by crystals that pulsed with stored knowledge. The professor looked at one of the crystals she had brought with knowledge that had survived thousands of years.
This tells us nothing about their culture or their everyday lives. It's just data storage. Hardly revolutionary.
But the city, in its quiet, unassuming way, continued its silent dialogue with the inhabitants. Objects appeared where they were most needed. Tools for Derek, whose agricultural ventures were blossoming against all odds, a strange handheld device for Greta, which translated the symbols adorning the city's walls. Most importantly, Angston was aided in the city that clearly understood his vast importance. He found eyeglasses that perfectly corrected his deteriorating vision on his desk. A fabric, light yet warm, appeared draped over his chair during a particularly cold night. Each item exactly what he needed at the moment, and as the city came to life, it wasn't just metal making it far more useful. and yet half the people in the colony seemed barely aware that anything odd was going on. At first, he assumed they were just that unaware of their surroundings. But it was so obvious that eventually, he became convinced that something was. As he began to focus on it, he began to understand. There seemed to be at least a few failsafes built in. For basic things, you could just get it, but anything bigger required multiple people. After trying to figure it out on his own for a few days, he asked Greta for one of the crystals. She had assumed that each crystal carried different information. But that was absurd. Humans had been accessing a central database of information since shortly after they created computers. After a day of trying to bring up the correct information on the crystal, he finally asked Greta, who brought him a different crystal. Then later, once he asked, she brought him a translator for it. The incompetence of that might have led to her being fired somewhere else, but on this world, there weren't any other choices, so he accepted her mistakes with good grace. He also found the information he needed. The technology wasn't explained all that well, but it was pretty simple. The technology was pretty much the same as the swarm bots the humans used to build their cities, except that the alien technology was microscopic. That was how things could appear out of nothing. But that wasn't what was important. What was important was the power of the technology. It had been so powerful that it had changed the entire society. A big part of that was that anyone had access to anything they wanted. Though that had been a bit more limited when there had been billions of people drawing on the energy rather than 1,000. That was why for bigger things there needed to be a consensus. You couldn't just change the design of a building on your own, in part because it affected other people, but mostly because it drew on a massive, but still limited resource. But it wasn't just that. The technology was able to keep law and order in the city. The dulling of dangerous emotions like shock and anger was one of those. That explained why people had been so calm while they were here. But it could go further than that. Since everyone agreed on things like murder and theft, it was enforced. The most disturbing was the removal of people who were considered bad for society by a large enough percent of people. It had been rare, but people could just fade away. He gathered the first real meeting after that. Most of the colony fit into one of the larger rooms they had found, and Angston stood in front.
I am here to explain to you that I have learned how the most important technology of this city works, and how we can control it. Though I do question if it's a good idea for most of you to have access to it. If you all agree, we could limit it to the intellectually capable. But we'll get to that. For now, we should remove the suppression of emotions. I don't think it's dangerous or controlling us, but I like the full range of my emotions.
There was some agreement, and as it spread, Angston felt the fear of this place begin to fade back in. The technology was immensely powerful, far beyond anything humans had had. And they didn't know it well enough to understand the safeguards. Especially since everyone that had been here had died. But there was something else. He saw the looks of people. Greta, who had been continually failing as his assistant, seemed to glare at him. Didn't she understand how patient he had been with her? And then there was Derek. He hadn't seen Angston much since he had been working on reviving the city, but he could almost feel the frustration. Many of the rest had been students of Angston, and they seemed to have not learned much. Something he may have expressed to them too often. Perhaps, he thought, we should have kept their emotions suppressed as he tried and failed to find a friendly face in the crowd. He then glanced down at his hands. For a split second, he saw his own hands and threw them at the same time. And then Professor Angston Trumble was gone. Author's note.
This story was originally going to be about the city and the technology. Nothing all that revolutionary, but a fun setting. Then I got to know Angston. In the first draft, he was mildly unlikable, but mostly just a bit gruff. But by the second draft, he became a lot more fun to write, and the end of the story became clear. A demonstration of the danger of the technology, a possible hint at what happened to the population, and a reminder that even if you're the smartest person out there, You're not smarter than everyone. I hope you all enjoyed it. If you did, you can sign up for my newsletter at sci-fi.com. Just look for the link that says free books. Or you can help me write more by visiting patreon.com/Elton. Every eye on it helps, and every dollar goes directly to paying for this endeavor. Thank you. Elton Gar.